So I'm using different equipment today, so if this doesn't work out, please let me know and I'll redo it for Monday. This is the first of 3 lectures dealing with television, so hopefully I have the timing right now so that there won't be awkward breaks in the middle. Anyway, here we have a model for thinking about popular culture in a wider sense. We've already talked about production and consumption, right? Production is referring to the process through which a text, object, or practice is generated. Consumption referring to the ways that people use it, the ways that people make meaning out of it, and the ways in which everyday people engage with it. So we also have these 3 other terms that we can work with. Regulation. This is what we're talking about in relation to hegemony. Regulation not just as a legal process, which is also important, especially if we're thinking about the article Beautiful Identities, but also referring to cultural regulation. For example, the construction of norms, the construction of ideology, and the work that ideology does to secure hegemony. Representation is a term that we've talked about briefly, but now we can talk about more expansively. We can talk about representation both in a cultural sense and in a political sense. Culturally, representation refers to the specific image or the specific idea or the specific product that's created, what is being represented. We can also talk about it politically in terms of what ideas it brings to surface, how those ideas get used, and how they also work towards hegemony. So we can understand regulation and representation as connected. And finally, we have identity. We can also understand identity in 2 ways. On the one hand, identity can refer to the ways in which people make meanings out of themselves through particular texts, objects, and practices. On the other hand, we can understand identity as an identity with our social world. Identity is referring to that relationship between the actual world and the world constructed by texts. For example, a couple of the readings refer to this link that people have between what they see on television and what they think is reality. So, we can understand these 5 different terms all connected together in that creation. The production of meaning, the consumption of meaning, the specific cultural work that it does, what it's representing, and how people take this to map onto the real world. So we're understanding popular culture texts as important cultural objects that are full of meaning and help make meaning. So, we can think about television in relation to these 5 different terms. So we're going to walk through the 6 different readings and think about how these different terms apply to them. First of all, we have the article Beautiful Identities, right? The discussion of Chicano cinema and how that became connected to representation on television. We can understand it in terms of extra-textual representation, right? The article gives a brief history to how the term Chicano cinema came about and how it relates to television. Chicano, of course, referring to the term that refers to civil rights struggles on the West Coast for Latinos and Latinas. So the extra-textual representation of saying that something represents the community. We can also understand the institutional forces of production. The article itself says very little about television, but it does talk about the specific legislation that came about as a result of those civil rights struggles on the West Coast. We can also talk about the legal regulation that affects both identity and consumption. There had to be specific legislation passed in terms of civil rights legislation in order for representation even to come on TV. So now we have this sort of legal category that tries to work through making sure that there are representations that speak to the actual diversity that we live in America. We also have the article Fish Out of Water, the article about Ugly Betty, which maybe some of you have seen, and maybe some of you want to write about for your journal. We can think about how identity becomes produced through these specific representations. And methodologically, it's an interesting article because the author follows a single representation through the series and looks at its ideological meanings. Some of those ideological meanings are open up what it means to be a Latina in the United States. But then we can also see how some ideological meanings also shut down what it means to be, for example, working at a fashion magazine. So following a single representation and looking at what it does and thinking about it in these terms. We also have Apu's brown voice, talking about Apu from The Simpsons. We can think about how the author brings attention to the process of production. When talking about things like animation, we don't really pay attention as much to the process of production. Who's doing the voices, who's doing the illustrations, and what that suggests. Because oftentimes, we dismiss animation as part of fantasy. But in thinking about Apu's brown voice, we think about how this process of production, Hank Azaria giving the voice, relates to the specific kind of representation that happens. We also see the entire history through how Apu became the South Asian's Quickie Mart owner, and how that plays into the universe of Springfield in The Simpsons. The author also gives a history to how identity is represented. Not just South Asians in the United States, but also thinking about it in terms of the history of colonialism, and how that entire archive of meaning shapes what we think of when we think about South Asians. The specific accent that we associate with it, and the specific appearance and traditions that we associate with it, in ways that homogenize the grand diversity of peoples from the region. And finally, we also see how representations also regulate. Shilpa Dave talks very carefully about how the representation of the brown voice has come to stand in for all South Asian representations, in a way where it's not quite a stereotype, because we often associate stereotypes with things that aren't true, but it becomes a stereotype in the larger sense, in terms of it being the only way that we have to represent what it means to be South Asian American. So this representation then participates in cultural regulation, how this single image begins to circulate and gains cultural currency as something that's ultrally meaningful. Our fourth article, Performing Race Negotiating Identity. The article about Asian American actors and what they have to say about the kinds of roles that are available to them. We can then pay attention to how the producers of these representations, what they think and the types of responsibilities and problems they see in the process. Oftentimes when we talk about stereotypes on TV, we oftentimes don't think of the actors as being involved in it, or we give them too much responsibility and say, if it's such a bad thing, then why are they doing it? So by thinking about what actors have to say about this connection between production, representation, and cultural regulation, we can see that actors possess a certain amount of agency. Agency, the ability to make choices. And we can see how these choices become very complicated, because to fully stand against the type of stereotypical representations that are demanded in the process of production literally means that these people would be out of work. So we see how they negotiate these impossible choices, on the one hand to make a living for themselves, but on the other hand with this keen awareness that their place in Hollywood is limited. We can also see how this process of production affects the process of consumption. There's only one kind of Asian American representation on television, because that's what becomes demanded in the process of production by the writers, the directors, and the executives, and even the screen testers. So then we can see how these actors work through the process of cultural regulation that bear down on how Asian American identity is represented. So then with the fifth article, we continue transitioning away from the specific image on television to thinking about the entire process of power and production in which it's connected. So with the fifth article, Watching Over the Border, we focus very carefully on the process of consumption. The author takes a focus group and really thinks about what they have to say as a complex network of meaning. So we get attention to the meanings made in consumption, which oftentimes we don't give enough attention to if we're focusing only on the image. What are everyday people saying about what appears on television or any popular culture media? We also see how specific identities get constructed through consumption, right? How US television and Mexican television take on these very distinct meanings in the minds of the consumers that don't necessarily match up to what either national genre is. But it's made meaningful through this link between consumption and identity. And our final one, How to Rehabilitate a Mulatto. Keep in mind this article was written before last year's controversy over Tiger Woods cheating on his wife, so this is back in the 2000s. We can see the legal regulation of identity through this historicizing of what it means for whiteness to be property. We're not faulting racially white people. We are thinking, however, about how race has been written into the law and how that remains in the historical archive of racial meaning. We can think about how our obsession with celebrity image relates to these ideological meanings, what can be said and what is said. So this connection between regulation, identity, and representation through the consumption of the celebrity image and the production of the image through places like tabloids or self-representation. All right, next lecture coming up.